In today's video, I'm going to show you 3 projects you can do on your CNC machine. A clock, wall art, and a pretty cool way to spruce up your drawer fronts. So let's get started. For your CNC cutting tool needs, check us out at bitsbits.com. The first project is a walnut and maple wall clock. To begin, I milled up some maple to a 1/4 inch thick, and then I'm edge gluing both pieces to get to the desired width. This book-matched piece of maple was resawn on the bandsaw, which left me with an awesome design in the center of the panel. The same goes for the walnut. Next, I cut the panels to size and apply glue to one of the 2 panels, and then I glue them together to get the desired thickness of a 1/2 inch. The first bit that I used was the Astra Coated 30-degree V-bit. I put it in the router and ran the G-code, and it primarily cut out the numbers and the logo. I set the final depth of cut so that it went all the way through the maple and into the walnut. This left me with a nice contrast to help the numbers and the logo both stand out. Next, I installed a 1/4 inch downcut spiral bit to cut out the clock. To install the hardware, I drill a hole in the center of the clock. To make this easier, I used the V-bit to mark the center of the panel, so all I had to do was line up the bit with the mark and then drill through. Before applying finish, I sanded the clock with 80, 120, 180, and 220 grit using my orbital sander. I also added a light chamfer to the edge of the front of the clock using a Whiteside 2292 chamfer bit. For the finish, I applied a coat of osmopolix using a cotton cloth. To get the finish down in the logo and the numbers, I used an acid brush. And after a few minutes, I wiped off the excess finish and then let it dry overnight before reinstalling the clock hardware. The next project I'm going to show you is a nice wall art that features a CNC tree. I start the project by breaking down a piece of 1/4 inch plywood to use for the tree. Next, I use double-sided tape to hold it in place while I cut the tree out. The bit that I used for this project was the Astra Coated 30-degree V-bit. This bit gets used all the time in my shop for decorative pieces. At the end of the job, you're left with the wall art as well as this pretty cool standalone tree that you could use for some other wall art, or perhaps make a base for it and put it on your desk at work. Let's start working on the frame that's going to hold the tree. To begin, I break down a piece of cherry and walnut, and then I mill those to 3/4 of an inch thick. Next, I cut them to width, but I don't cut the length yet. I do that with the miter sled. I put a Whiteside rabbeting bit in my router table, and then I cut a rabbet on the back side of the frame pieces that's going to hold the artwork and the glass. I make the rabbet in 2 passes, raising the bit each time until I get to the final depth. Now I cut the miters for the frame. I begin by cutting the miter on one end, and then I measure and mark for the miter on the opposite end, and then I use my stop block on the fence to get repeatable cuts. To reinforce the miters, I mark for dominoes. I installed a single 5mm by 30mm domino on each corner, but since 30mm is too long, I had to trim the dominoes using a handsaw. To glue the frame together, I put glue on the miter and the dominoes. I wiped off any glue squeeze out and then clamped the frame together using a strap clamp. After the glue dried, I sanded the face of the picture frame using 80 grit, 120 grit, 180 grit, and 220 grit sandpaper using the orbital sander. To ease the edges, I use 220 grit sandpaper. To make the tree stand out, I dyed the backer board black using an India ink. If after the first coat it doesn't look dark enough, you can always apply a second coat. My goal was to keep the plywood as bright as possible, and an oil finish wouldn't be the best finish for this use. I sprayed 3 coats of a satin acrylic and then let it dry overnight. To finish the frames, I wiped on a coat of Osmopolix to bring out the rich color of the cherry and the walnut. Now we can start to assemble the frames by inserting a piece of glass, the artwork, and then the backer board. To hold everything into place, I installed a few 1-inch turn buttons with screws. The final hardware to install was a sawtooth hanger at the top. And the frames were done. The third and final CNC project isn't a complete project, but rather a tip on how you can make your drawer fronts look awesome. While building my CNC cabinet, I figured I would get some practice in and draw 2 Game of Thrones houses on each drawer front. Before putting the board in the CNC machine, I put some stencil film on top of the drawer fronts so that after the CNC job is done, I can paint the artwork using some spray paint. The first task was to use an Astra Coated 1/8-inch compression bit to remove a bulk of the waste. The best way to use a compression bit is to cut at least as deep as the upcut portion of the bit on the first pass. And finally, I installed the Astra Coated 30-degree V-bit to carve out the finer details of the artwork. To give the artwork a nice contrasting appearance, I sprayed the carved sections using a flat black spray paint, and then after the paint dried, I removed the stencil film and installed the drawer fronts. I hope you enjoyed this 3-in-1 CNC Projects video. For more information about the bits used in this video, please visit bitsbits.com.